Welcome to Heart of the West, where every mark tells a tale. Samuel Ward pressed his weathered hands against the windowsill, watching twilight descend across the plains. 45 harsh winters had carved lines into his face, and this season felt like the cruelest yet. Gray streaked his beard, and sorrow sat heavy on his frame, grief that had real weight to it. 3 years had passed since he'd laid his beloved wife to rest beneath that bent cottonwood by the stream, the tree itself seeming broken by loss. Since that day, Samuel had embraced solitude, not from inability to communicate, but because no voice seemed worthy of breaking his quiet. The house held her essence like sacred ground. Her hand-woven wrap remained draped over the chair he never occupied. Dusty herb bundles lined the shelves, untouched since her gentle fingers had last arranged them. He still claimed only half their bed, leaving the other side forever empty. They'd lost a baby girl once too, a daughter who'd never drawn breath. After that tragedy, Samuel abandoned building nurseries. Instead, he constructed barriers, patched leather goods, and withdrew from the world. The townspeople whispered about the solitary man who appeared monthly, speaking only when necessary for commerce. Some claimed grief had driven him mad. Others insisted he'd always been peculiar. That particular evening, as darkness painted the sky, an unfamiliar sound reached his ears, something beyond the wind's voice, weak and halting. Initially he thought perhaps an injured coyote limped across the frozen ground, but stepping outside with his shotgun carried more from routine than alarm. He discovered her. She lay crumpled in the snow beneath the cedar, near his barn, curled inward, as if the wind had hollowed her out. Her dress was ripped at the shoulder, blood staining the fabric down to her wrist. Barefoot and young, motionless as the deer he'd once hunted during lean times, Samuel simply stared. For an extended moment, as a man might regard something beyond belief. Then he lowered his weapon. He asked nothing about her identity or origins, simply gathered her in careful arms, afraid she might crumble at his touch. She felt lighter than anguish itself, and carried the scent of running water and campfire. Smoke, crossing his threshold with her, felt like inviting a tempest indoors. He settled her beside the hearth, wrapping her in his one untainted blanket. She stirred slightly, lips parched and split, murmuring in an unfamiliar tongue that somehow resonated in his chest. Comanche, perhaps. He hadn't encountered their people in this territory for years, not since military forces had expelled them under the banner of peace. But this young woman, barely 20, appeared to be fleeing from more than soldiers. He warmed water and gently cleansed the blood from her skin. The arm wound was significant, but not life-threatening, deep enough to weaken her through blood loss, yet clean. Using skills from his former life as a battlefield medic, for war, before farming, before everything unraveled, he stitched her carefully. She observed him through half-closed eyes, flinching only when needle met flesh. Neither spoke. Finishing, he stepped outside to wash his hands in snow and let the wind clear his lungs. The rising moon cast lengthy shadows across the grassland. He gazed at that cedar tree for a long while, his wife's favorite. She'd planted wildflowers around its base each spring. They'd never returned after her passing. Inside, the girl had moved closer to the flames, now sleeping. Her breathing remained shallow, but steady. Lingered in the doorway briefly, then settled into his fireside chair. He didn't attempt sleep, nor did he watch her. He simply observed the flames. Remembering the last time he'd shared this space with another's presence, he convinced himself she'd vanish by daybreak. But morning arrived, and she remained. She woke before sunrise, sitting upright with fear-born alertness. Samuel had left cornbread and jerky on a plate nearby. She reached for it like a cornered creature, swift and cautious. He sat at the table with his coffee, not staring but not ignoring her either. When their eyes met, he saw no demands. No pleas, no gratitude, just an uncertain peace between strangers. "You're protected here," he said, voice rough from disuse. For the time being, she didn't respond, but she didn't flee. Snow intensified that day. Samuel tended his animals, inspected fencing, and broke ice on the water trough. he worked with his usual deliberate pace. Returning, he found she'd swept the hearth and folded the blanket. He noticed her eyeing the pantry shelves. Hunger spoke silently, yet carved visible lines and faces. That evening, he prepared stew beans, salt pork, and wild onions. She ate slowly, movements precise, almost ritualistic. He observed how she chewed on only one side, suspecting a hidden bruise beneath her dark hair. He didn't inquire about who had harmed her. She offered no explanations, as the storm worsened that night. With wind howling like something mourning its own voice, Samuel stoked the fire and offered her the bed while he took the chair. It's not kindness, he told himself, mere practicality. The bed provided more warmth for her recovery. Near midnight, he woke to find her silhouetted at the window, scanning the horizon for something or someone. He rose slowly. Expecting difficulties? He asked. She turned, truly looking at him for the first time. After a heavy, fragile silence, she nodded once. Samuel understood trouble in many forms: warfare, starvation, loss. But this felt different. This wasn't his burden, yet it had already settled into his existence. He retrieved a blanket from a chair. You'll remain tonight. We'll sort everything else at sunrise. She regarded him with something unreadable, not trust yet, but no longer fear either. He returned to his chair, leaned back, and listened to the fire's crackle as wind battered the walls. Something within him had shifted, though he couldn't name it. The silence no longer felt like morning. When dawn bled through the shutters in pink and pale hues, Samuel stepped outside to feed his horses. He hadn't seen fresh tracks in weeks, but this morning his breath caught hoof prints, dozens of them, circling his cabin like a noose. Looking toward the ridge, he saw them. Riders, dozens perhaps, painted faces, spears gleaming in sunlight. A figure at their head sat tall in his saddle, cloak whipping like wings. Comanche. Samuel's chest tightened not with fear, but with cold clarity. He turned slowly back toward the house. Inside, the girl stood near the fire, eyes wide but unsurprised. He said nothing. Neither did she in that stillness. Something passed between them, quiet understanding that neither was safe, but neither would run. Not anymore. The morning light rose slowly, bruised, casting long rose streaks across the snow-covered plains. The air bit with cold sharp enough to sting lungs, still enough that every sound traveled far. Samuel Ward stood outside, one hand on the fence rail, the other holding a dented coffee cup gone lukewarm. He sipped without tasting, watching a change on the horizon. He'd ranched long enough to recognize when the world went quiet in the wrong way. No birds called, no rabbits darted from brush. Even the wind had stilled, as if the land itself held its breath. Then came the shimmer, barely visible initially, a ripple in the distance, disturbed dust. Next came the sound, the low rhythmic thunder of hooves. He didn't move at first. He set the cup down carefully on the fence post, as if afraid to wake something ancient. Then he walked toward the cabin, boots crunching softly in frostbitten snow inside. The girl stood at the hearth, wrapping linen tighter around her healing arm. Her hair was loosely braided back, and there was alertness in her posture, not fear, but readiness. "They've arrived," Samuel said. She looked up, eyes already wide, growing distant. He reached for the Winchester above the door, but didn't take it down. His hand paused, then dropped. The rifle wouldn't help him now. He stepped outside again, and this time she followed. The horses came into full view, cresting the low ridge like a wave of earth and bone in motion. Dozens, 60, 70, perhaps all mounted, all silent. Their approach was deliberate, not a charge, but a claim. They rode as one. Formation tight and unnervingly quiet, snow muffling even the hoofbeats. At their head was a man draped in black wolf fur, while his face bore red war paint streaks, running like tears down his cheeks. His horse alone wore feather decorations, braided into mane and tail, each stained with ochre and ashdot. His expression was unreadable, carved from ancient stone and darker knowledge. He stopped a dozen yards from the cabin while the others formed, a wide circle behind him, surrounding the house without raising a single weapon. The girl stepped forward before Samuel could speak. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Father," she said. The mounted man said nothing. His gaze passed over her, then settled on Samuel. Samuel remained still, arms loose at his sides, feet planted. He didn't speak. There was no point explaining something neither man had words for. He only watched, trying to understand what this father saw. Broken-spirited white man with a ghost-filled cabin, standing beside his only daughter. The silence stretched long enough for wind to return, brushing along the gathering's edges like breath trying to revive a fire. Then the father spoke, voice a low, solemn rumble. "You sheltered her." It wasn't a question. Samuel gave a slow nod. The Comanche leader dismounted, snow creaking beneath his boots. He walked forward with calm authority, the way some men walked into battle or prayer. When he stopped, only a few paces from Samuel, close enough to strike, close enough to see sleeplessness etched into each other's faces, the girl stepped between them. She chose not to return, she said quietly, but with certainty that needed no amplification. The warriors didn't move, nor did Samuel. The father's eyes, dark and ancient, flicked toward his daughter, then back to Samuel. "She crossed into death," he said, "and you gave her breath again." "I didn't give her anything," Samuel answered. "She took it back herself." The girl's father studied him for a long moment, something shifting, not softening, but recalibrating. A measure of the man before him. His hand rose slowly. Samuel tensed, but it was only to touch the girl's chin. "You are not a child," he said to her, "and still I hope to decide for you." She didn't flinch. "I did not run from you. I ran from men who took more than they had right to." That hit the air like soundless thunder. The leader looked away then, toward the open prairie behind Samuel's homestead. The past stretched out there, tangled with blood, treaties, silence, and sorrow. He turned back to Samuel. "My warriors will not strike today." Relief, subtle and swift, passed through the girl's shoulders, but Samuel didn't relax. "I heard the unspoken part. They may return," the father continued. "Not in peace. You have 3 days. Then I come. Not as a father, but as a chief." He mounted again in fluid movement. No dramatic turn, no shouted command. The circle of warriors slowly turned with him, their horses moving like tidewater pulled by an unseen moon. Within minutes they were gone. Leaving only churned snow and retreating hoofbeats, Samuel stood watching until even the last silhouette vanished into horizon haze. He exhaled then, not deeply, just enough to feel breath leave his body. Inside, the cabin had grown cold. The fire had dipped low. He tossed more wood onto it, sparks jumping like startled birds. The girl sat at the bed's edge now, face unreadable. "You should accompany them," Samuel said, not unkindly. She looked up. "And go where?" "Back to silence? Back to marrying some man who sees me only as a name on a treaty?" He had no answer. "You gave me a room that didn't lock," she added almost softly. "That was enough." He busied himself with the fire again, not because it needed tending, but because he couldn't look at her too long without feeling something shift beneath his skin. He didn't know what to do with it yet. 3 days. He counted them like grains in an hourglass, each one a chance to lose her or keep her. Later that evening, as wind howled across the chimney mouth, Samuel sat by the window with a mug in hand, his heart wandering too close to places he'd long avoided. She was across the room, weaving leather into something that might become a pouch or might become a story. Her hands moved with purpose, like she'd done this all her life, like creating something new. It was a quiet way of reclaiming something old. He watched her from his peripheral vision, not out of desire, not yet, but out of wonder. Of all the people, to find his doorstep, why her? Why now? She caught him watching, didn't smile, didn't look away. "You don't fear them," she said. "No. Why?" "I've already lost what most men fear to lose." She nodded slowly. "I have not. I've nearly." The fire snapped. Outside, a coyote yipped in the distance. Samuel looked toward the sound but said nothing. "Ain't. Won't ask you to keep me," she said, voice low. "But I won't leave unless you make me." He looked at her, then really looked. She wasn't soft like his wife had been. She didn't carry lightness or easy laughter. She carried storm silence and the stubborn root of something growing in scorched ground. He didn't tell her to leave. He didn't say she could stay. Just stood and stoked the fire again, and she returned to her weaving. And the world turned one breath closer to whatever came next. Outside, tracks of 70 horses remained etched into the snow, a warning. A promise, or perhaps a mark left by fate's own hand. And somewhere in Samuel's chest, something long dormant began to stir, quiet as wind before it sings. The following morning arrived, muted and pale, a sky like linen stretched thin over the horizon. The snow hadn't melted, but it had softened. Winter's brittle edge momentarily dulled. Samuel Ward stepped into the hush, the weight of the Comanche chief's words like stones in his coat pocket. 2 days remained. He busied himself as men do who have more thoughts than they know what to handle. Feed the horses, check the tack, mend the chicken wire. The girl moved through the cabin like a ghost turned tangible, her touch light, steps careful but never timid. He noticed how she took to small tasks without being asked. She swept the hearth, cleaned his tin plates, folded blankets, and once after dusk, refilled the woodpile with an armful she'd gathered herself. They still spoke little. Words between them were chosen sparingly, like water in drought. Silence had changed, no longer a wall, but something softer, a room both occupied. She asked for his wife's name. It was the first time her voice came with intention. "Marjorie," Samuel said, quiet as falling snow. She didn't say more. But later, that day, he noticed she'd placed the old shawl, the one Marjorie used to wear, while baking neatly folded at the bed's foot. She'd taken the one from the chair's back instead. He watched her more now. Not with hunger or heat, but with steady, unsettled curiosity. The girl was younger than the years written into her eyes. There was silence in her, yes, but it wasn't empty. It was shaped like someone who had listened long before she was ever allowed to speak. She had a way of watching animals that reminded him of Marjorie, head tilted slightly. It's like trying to understand their language. One morning, he found her crouched near the chicken coop, holding out a biscuit scrap to the hen who'd once pecked his palm raw. The bird took it gently from her hand. He passed her a length of leather later that day, supple and sun-darkened, and said, "Thought you might want to make something from it." She nodded, then looked him in the eye and said, "Thank you." The words landed softly, but with weight. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, close but never touching. She sang once, not loudly, not for him, a low lullaby in Comanche, full of sand and wind and smoke. He didn't ask what the words meant. Some things weren't meant to be translated. Instead, he listened. He began to speak again, piece by piece, not stories, not yet, just fragments. She learned he had once been a medic. In the war where brother turned on brother and fields bloomed red, he told her he came west, not for gold, but because the silence here suited him. She asked no questions, and he liked that about her. One evening, as dusk bruised the sky's edge, he returned from town with supplies. Miss Leahy, the storekeeper, had eyed him strangely when he bought fabric and tea. Her mouth had pursed when he asked for an extra tin cup. "You've got company, Sam?" she asked, her tone sharper than the question warranted. "I've got someone passing through," he replied. She squinted. "Company's not always good company. She's not trouble," he said. "She's a Comanche girl," Leahy whispered, as though the word might curdle if spoken aloud. "I've got a way of turning even quiet men wild." Samuel had paid and left without another word. That night he brought out the fabric and laid it on the table without fanfare. The girl looked at it for a long time before reaching out and touching it, just a faint brush of her fingers over the blue cotton. She didn't speak, but her expression held something close to gratitude. The next morning, he found her stitching it into a tunic, handwork so precise it could have been machine-made. She worked by the fire, sunlight glinting off the needle. She looked calm, but her eyes flicked toward the window. Samuel noticed. "You expecting them back before tomorrow?" She nodded. "They won't wait." He didn't ask if she was afraid. Later, as wind picked up and clouds rolled in low, Samuel saddled his mare and rode to the canyon ridge overlooking the trail. He saw nothing not yet, but felt it. The weight of what was coming had teeth. When he returned, the cabin smelled of broth. She'd used what he'd brought, dried beans, carrots, a strip of pork. She gestured for him to sit, ladled out 2 bowls, and placed them on the table. It was the first time they shared a meal that felt like communion rather than survival. Afterward, he stood beside the hearth, watching fire consume kindling. Stood behind him, not close, not touching, but there. I dreamed of a river last night, she said. Back home, I was small again. My mother washed my hair in the shallows. I hadn't thought of her in years. He turned slightly. She's gone. Nodded. Sick in the winter? No medicine. His throat worked around words that never came. You remind me of her, she said.
Ow.
You listen the way she did. Like every silence is a sentence you're still learning to read. He didn't know what to do with that, so he said what he could. You're not what I expected. Neither are you. They didn't speak after that. But something opened. Something shifted. The next day he showed her how to shape rawhide into reins, how to knot them strong enough to hold against a pulling horse. She taught him a different kind of knot, the kind used to bind sinew to arrow shafts. They worked beside each other in the yard as wind curled between them, scattering hay and snow. It felt like building something, felt like language. That evening she braided his horse's mane, humming under her breath. He watched her hands, watched the way her fingers moved, nimble, precise, deliberate. She looked up once, catching him staring, and smiled. Just the smallest curve of her lips. It undid something in him. She stayed by the fire longer that night. He didn't ask her to, but he didn't move either. When she leaned her head against his chair's edge, her hair brushing his arm, he didn't pull. Away they sat like that, 2 shadows stitched together by warmth. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say, I don't know what this is, but it's more than silence. He wanted to tell her about the dreams he'd started having again, of holding his daughter, of Marjorie laughing in spring wind, but he didn't. The next morning, there were tracks in the snow again. It's not near the house, not yet, but close enough. Time had narrowed. He watched her from the porch. She stood by the cedar tree, hand on its trunk, eyes closed. She looked like someone saying goodbye. You think they'll take you? He asked when she came back inside. They'll try. I could leave. Ride with you. Get you past the ridge. She shook her head. You run. They'll chase harder. They'll think you took me, that it was about conquest, not choice. His jaw clenched. And if I tell them otherwise, they won't believe you. Not at first. You're not one of them. You're not one of us. He stared at her, fire crackling behind him. Then who are we? She looked at him, her eyes, dark, fierce, wounded, holding something tender. Maybe we're the language between. Night, the storm came again, not with snow, but with wind and dust and a sky full of restless clouds. They sat close by the fire, knees nearly touching, breath sinking in slow rhythm. He told her, then finally, about his daughter, about the tiny grave beneath the cottonwood, and how he couldn't bring himself to name her because naming something meant believing it had lived. She took his hand, held it. Her fingers were rougher than Marjorie's had been, but warmer, stronger. I think she lived, she said, even if only in your dreams. He couldn't answer. He wanted to kiss her, but didn't. Not yet. The moment asked only for nearness. They slept in the same room that night, him in the chair, her on the bed, but neither truly slept. The air was too full of waiting. In the dark he whispered, What's your name, Nahili? He tasted it, let it settle on his tongue. Nahili. She breathed in like she hadn't heard it said like that in years. Outside, the wind shifted, and the final morning waited just beyond sleep's edge. The morning broke without color, a sky stretched thin with ash and wind. The land had changed overnight. It no longer felt like a quiet place. It felt like a drum skin stretched too tight, ready to snap. The air was restless, each gust tugging at the world's corners like unseen hands testing for weakness. Samuel stood at the porch's edge, worn wool blanket around his shoulders, eyes fixed on the horizon. There was no need to guess anymore. The Comanche would return today, The line had been drawn not with words, but with silence, with hooves that circled the home and eyes that burned without ever raising a voice. Inside, Nahili moved with slow precision, face unreadable. She braided her hair back tightly, tied her tunic with leather cord, and checked the stitching along her arm's bandage. She dressed, not as a girl waiting for rescue, but as someone bracing for what would come. Whatever form it took, Samuel watched her through the doorway. He wanted to ask what she planned to do, but part of him already knew. She hadn't come here for safety. She'd stayed for freedom. And now that the choice stood sharpened and waiting, she would face it, not flee from it. He made coffee, though. His hands shook just enough to spill drops across the counter. She joined him at the table, and for a time, they just sat two people surrounded by quiet. Trying to memorize the stillness before it vanished, she spoke first. They will want me to return not just because I am daughter to a chief, but because I left without permission. They see me as belonging. You don't, Samuel said softly. Belong to anyone. Her eyes met his. That is not how they see it. A woman taken or sheltered is a woman claimed. They will not ask why you helped me. They will assume they already know. He looked down at his calloused hands. Then we tell them. They may not listen. Then we make them. She looked at him as if seeing something deeper beneath his quiet knot. Stubbornness, but resolve forged from sorrow. She reached across the table and placed her fingers over his. They stayed there for a long time. By noon, the clouds had gathered thick and low, swelling with a nameless storm. Wind dragged dust across the ground in curls, whispering warnings against the cabin walls. The first rumble of thunder didn't come from the sky. It came from the earth's hooves returning. Samuel stepped outside again. He had oiled the rifle that morning, but left it leaning inside the door. It wouldn't help him today. This was not a fight of bullets or steel. This was something older. The horses came in tighter this time. No circle, just a line across the field. A wall of riders dressed in war paint and silence. At their center stood Chief Naveau, his wolf cloak broad as ever, but his expression drawn. His gaze found Nahili as soon as she stepped outside. She did not hide behind Samuel. She stood beside him, eyes steady, spine straight. Naveau raised a hand, and the warriors behind him dismounted. Still no weapons drawn, but the weight of intention hung heavy as the storm clouds above. You have had your days, Naveau said. Now she returns. She's not property, Samuel replied. She is daughter, Naveau answered. That is not ownership. That is bond. And when a bond is broken, something dies. Nahili took a step forward, voice steady, each word deliberate, and let it die. If it was built on silence, it caused a murmur among the warriors. Navo's jaw tensed. You speak like one who forgets blood. I speak like one who has seen what happens when blood is all that binds. Naveau approached now, eyes burning into hers. You would stay with a man who does not know our ways, who cannot speak to our dead, who will never walk the path you were born into. I would stay with a man who let me be, she said, who saw me before he needed me to be anything. Navo's eyes turned to Samuel, and for a long moment father and widower stood again in that unspoken crossing. No man raised his voice. No man moved. You took her, Naveau said. I opened a door, Samuel answered. She walked through it. You love her. The words settled in the space between wind and silence. Samuel looked to Nahili and then back. I lost everything I loved. Still, I wouldn't ask her to stay unless she wanted to. Naveau turned his face slightly, as if listening for something else beneath the words. Then slowly, he unhooked a blade from his belt, a ceremonial knife, old and etched with weathered carvings. He stepped forward and held it out, not as threat, but as offering. A man does not win a daughter, he said. He proves whether he will break under her weight or carry it with honor. Samuel looked at the knife but didn't take it. Naveau continued, We have a right. You will hunt with me. One deer, one path. If you walk it without flinching, then I will know what kind of man you are. Samuel said nothing for a moment, and nodded once. Nahili touched his hand as he turned to go her grip, neither desperate nor pleading, just warm. Present, the men rode out together, chief and rancher, into the low hills where sagebrush grew thick and trees broke the wind. The deer they found was neither old nor young a buck, with wide eyes and keen ears. Naveau motioned to Samuel, offering him the chance. Samuel took the boughs, the same one Nahili had strung days earlier, and moved through the brush like he had during war. He did not rush. He did not force the moment. When he loosed the arrow, it struck just behind the shoulder, clean and true. They brought the deer back as rain finally began to fall, not hard, but steady, like something long held back had been released. The warriors stood waiting, expressions unreadable. Naveau dismounted, and stood before Samuel again.
Ass!
You do not speak like us, he said. You do not know our words, but your actions say what your mouth does not. Then, without ceremony, he turned to Nahili. You are no longer of my fire, he said. You are not gone from my heart. He touched her forehead with 2 fingers, then turned and walked to his horse. The warriors mounted. No battle came. No blood spilled, just departure. Rain. When the sound of hooves faded again into the waiting horizon, Samuel and Nahili stood alone in the quiet. The storm did not howl, Let wept. They entered the cabin in silence. She removed her wet tunic and wrapped herself in one of Marjorie's old shawls, and he hung his coat to dry. The fire hissed where the logs were damp, but the warmth held steady. She approached him slowly, hands bare, eyes raw. You didn't flinch, she said. Didn't know I had the choice. I was ready to leave. I would have let you. She stepped closer, and he let her. There was no trembling now, no breath held back. I want to stay, she said. He reached out, touched her cheek. Her skin was damp from rain, but warm. Then stay, he said, as if there was nothing else in the world more simple or more sacred. And in that moment, the storm passed. Later, he would remember the way the rain hit the roof like a lullaby, and how her fingers found his not in urgency, but in quiet trust. They did not speak of forever. They spoke only in touches, in glances, in breaths shared beneath the shadow of thunderclouds, now drifting away. Outside, the tracks of the horses filled slowly with water. The fire inside crackled, and the 2 people who had been lost not from the world, but from themselves began to root again together in soil softened by rain. The sun rose slow and honey gold, warming the frost that clung to tall prairie grass. For the first time in weeks, the sky was clear blue as a newborn's eyes, wide as breath long held and finally released. The storm had passed not only in the sky, but between them. The wind had stilled. The danger was gone. Samuel Ward stood by the barn with a bucket in one hand and a worn bridle slung over his shoulder. His coat was patched at the elbows and speckled with hay, but his posture had shifted, less like a man weighed down and more like a man rooted behind him. The cabin no longer looked like a tomb. Smoke rose from the chimney in a clean, steady ribbon dot inside. Nahili moved through the morning light, barefoot, hair braided down her back in a single dark rope. She didn't hum as she worked. That wasn't her way, but there was rhythm in her now, kind of steadiness that hadn't been there before. She chopped herbs, folded linen, and carried water without hesitation. Each movement was her own, chosen. Freely, there was no fear in her hands anymore. Samuel watched her from the window as she spread a blanket out to dry. The shawl she wore was no longer his wife's. It had been stitched with new edges, a strip of the blue cloth he'd bought in town, sewn into the hem. Her creation now, her life woven in the past, respected, not replaced. He turned from the window and picked up the small bundle near the hearth. Inside was a necklace, 3 carved bone beads on a leather thong. It's the kind his own mother had worn when he was a child. He held it for a long moment, thumb brushing over the center bead before, placing it carefully on the table where Nahili would find it. A gift, nothing grand, just a gesture that said, I see you. I choose you. Wordless offerings had become their language. Outside, the road stretched toward town, dusty and sun-baked now, its memory of snow fading. There was a matter that needed tending, one that couldn't be delayed. Samuel saddled the horse, and Nahili stepped onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tighter. She said nothing at first, but her brow furrowed slightly. "You're riding into town," she said. He nodded. "They'll have questions about why the Comanche came and left without blood." She studied him. "You'll tell them what they need to hear." She looked past him toward the horizon. 1.